The chandeliers glittered above like frozen fireworks, their light sharp and unfeeling as it spilled across the Harrington mansion's study. They were meant to impress visitors, to remind anyone who entered that this house belonged to a man of unimaginable wealth and power. But to 12-year-old Ethan Harrington, they only seemed to cast shadows that pressed down on him like a weight he couldn't escape. On the massive mahogany desk lay a scattering of papers, their white surfaces scarred with red ink. Every page bore the same brutal scarlet mark, the letter F slashed across the top like a sentence handed down in court. Ethan sat hunched over the desk, his thin shoulders curled inward, his blonde hair falling across his eyes as he gripped his pencil until the wood dug into his skin. He tried once more, forcing himself to copy the words on the page, but the letters twisted into nonsense, mocking him as they slid across the lines. His vision blurred, and the frustration boiled until he slammed the workbook shut with a sharp crack. The sound echoed against the marble floors and high walls, swallowed up by silence so thick it seemed alive. That silence was broken by footsteps, measured, heavy, purposeful. Mr. Harrington entered the room, the billionaire father whose presence alone seemed to shrink the air. His suit was pressed with the precision of a blade, his cufflinks catching the cold light like tiny suns. In his hand he held one of Ethan's failed tests as though it were a piece of evidence. He did not pause to soften the blow. "Worthless," he said flatly, the word landing with the weight of a gavel. His eyes, sharp and carved with disappointment, swept over the boy as though he were appraising a bad investment. He held up the test, the red ink glaring like bloodstains. "You'll never be half the man I am." Ethan swallowed hard. His throat burned, but he didn't cry. He had trained himself not to, not after years of these sentences that cut deeper than any punishment. Around them, servants passed silently in the halls, their eyes lowered, their movements quick. They had long learned that when Mr. Harrington's voice turned cold, survival meant disappearing. Perhaps sensing his son's silence as defiance, the billionaire continued. "Maybe it's time to send you away, somewhere failure isn't tolerated, a boarding school." His tone carried finality, like exile disguised as opportunity. The words sank deep into Ethan's chest, heavy and merciless. He lowered his eyes to the floor, unable to meet his father's gaze. In his mind, the thought repeated like a cruel refrain, not a new beginning, just a place to vanish. Mr. Harrington turned and left, his polished shoes striking against marble with each step. His presence lingered long after he was gone, leaving the boy alone with his shame. The chandelier's brilliance mocked him still, a frozen storm above his bowed head. Ethan whispered to himself so softly that even the walls barely heard. "Maybe I really am broken." The words weren't angry. They were tired, resigned, the voice of a child who had learned too soon that his efforts only ever ended in failure. From the doorway, Clara, the senior maid, watched silently as she collected the silver tray left untouched from lunch. Her eyes met Chef Daniel's across the hall, and her voice dropped to a whisper once Mr. Harrington was gone. "Another tutor gone," she muttered, shaking her head. Daniel smirked, clattering pots for emphasis. "They spend fortunes flying in specialists, and none can fix the boy. Poor kid looks more lost every day." Their words cut through the silence like knives, though Ethan pretended not to hear. His cheeks burned hotter than the chandelier's glow. He wanted to vanish, to fold himself small enough that no one could see him, no one could notice the red letters that followed him everywhere. That night, alone in his room, he sat on the edge of his bed with a crumpled paper in his hand. Around him, the walls gleamed with trophies his father had purchased, hollow victories that meant nothing to him. He looked at them the way one might look at strangers, decorations for a life he didn't belong to. His voice was barely a whisper in the vast silence. "Maybe I really am broken." The mansion was grand, polished, and filled with the scent of expensive cologne. But it was also empty of warmth, empty of kindness. And in that emptiness, change was coming. The next morning, through the service entrance, a new maid would arrive, a black woman named Marissa Johnson, her shoes scuffed from a life the Harringtons would never understand. To most of the staff, she was invisible, just another replacement in a long line of maids who would not last. But what no one knew, not Clara, not Daniel, not even the billionaire himself, was that this woman, overlooked and underestimated, would soon teach the boy what all the experts could not. And that was how, in a mansion built on billions, where chandeliers glittered but warmth was absent, the quiet beginning of something extraordinary stirred. The story of a boy believed to be broken was about to change, because sometimes the person no one notices is the one who sees everything. The service entrance of the Harrington mansion was nothing like the grand marble staircases guests used. No chandeliers glittered here, no polished railings shone. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution and ironed linen, a world meant to stay invisible. It was through this door that Marissa Johnson stepped on a gray morning, her shoes worn at the edges, her uniform plain, her leather handbag sagging with age. She was 32, dark-skinned, her curls tied back under a scarf faded from too many washings. To anyone else, she looked like just another, her maid passing through, a face that would blur into memory within a week. Clara, the senior maid, was the first to notice her. She leaned against the pantry doorway, arms folded as she watched Marissa unpack her small set of cleaning supplies with quiet precision. There was no fumbling, no wasted movement. Every cloth, every bottle, every brush was lined neatly on the counter, as if order itself had followed her through the door. Clara's eyebrow lifted, skeptical. "She's a new one," she muttered to Chef Daniel, who was slapping dough onto a counter. "Give it a week." Daniel smirked, his hands dusted with flour. "The boy'll drive her out faster than spoiled milk. Rich people think money can buy brains. Wait until she tries to clean up his tantrums." His chuckle was low, certain, almost cruel. Marissa heard every word but gave no reply. She had learned long ago that the loudest voices often saw the least. Her silence was not weakness, it was armor. She moved with patience, her hands steady, her back straight. Yet beneath her calm face, her heart carried a memory, the sight of her younger self at a chipped kitchen table, her mother tracing letters in the air, whispering, "Baby, they don't hate you, they just look different to you. We'll figure them out together." By the afternoon, she was assigned her first route through the house, dusting shelves, polishing frames, collecting the fingerprints of a life built on wealth she could only ever touch with a cloth. She moved quietly, her steps careful against the polished floors. It was when she reached the heavy oak door of the study that she paused. The air inside was thick with the smell of ink and paper. Through the half-open door, she saw him. Ethan Harrington, 12 years old. Shoulders bent, blonde hair falling across his face as he gripped a pencil too tightly. His eraser scratched furiously across the page, over and over, trying to erase mistakes that seemed endless. His small fist was red from pressing too hard. Around him lay torn sheets, crumpled balls of paper like fallen soldiers on the floor. He pressed again, trying to copy a single line, but each attempt collapsed into angry scribbles until the paper itself tore. Marissa froze, her dusting cloth forgotten in her hand. She knew that look, the wide eyes begging the page to make sense, the frustration boiling into shame. It was the same look she had once worn, sitting on that cracked kitchen chair, convinced the world was built for everyone else but her. For a moment, her chest tightened with a pain that wasn't just sympathy, it was recognition. Ethan noticed her then. His eyes flicked up, suspicious, guarded. He expected scolding, pity, or worse, mockery. That was all adults ever gave him. But Marissa didn't sigh, didn't shake her head, didn't lecture. She only softened her gaze, let the smallest smile curve her lips, and said gently, "You grip that pencil like it's a sword. No wonder the paper's fighting back." The boy blinked. Confusion rippled across his face. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not his tutors, not his father, not the endless line of nannies who had given up. She didn't press further. She bent, picked up a fallen paper, smoothed its wrinkles with careful fingers, and laid it back on his desk. Then she returned to her dusting as though nothing unusual had happened, humming softly under her breath. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, frowning, but it wasn't anger that moved across his face. It was something else, curiosity. That night, while the staff gathered in the kitchen to gossip, Clara hissed under her breath. "She thinks she knows better than the tutors. She'll end up like the rest." Daniel snorted, wiping his hands on a rag. "Fired by next week." Their laughter was sharp, certain, almost rehearsed. Marissa heard them, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't in this house to impress the staff or the billionaire who Ned her paycheck. She was there because patience was the only gift life had left her, and she knew what it meant to be unseen, dismissed, written off as broken. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that upstairs a boy lay under his blanket, whispering to himself words he had never before dared to believe. No wonder the paper's fighting back. And for the first time in months, Ethan drifted to sleep without the weight of failure crushing his chest. The chandeliers above glittered cold as ever, but somewhere deep in the mansion's silence, a new story had begun to stir. The study smelled faintly of old paper and frustration. Ethan sat stiffly at the desk, his head bent low over a workbook that already looked wounded, its corners bent, its surface scarred with eraser marks and pencil dents. He pressed the pencil so hard into the page that the tip trembled. His lips moved silently as he tried again to copy the words written neatly at the top, but the letters betrayed him. They slid, flipped, blurred into shapes that didn't stay still. He clenched his jaw, erased furiously, then scribbled over the same line until the paper tore. The pencil snapped in his grip. The sharp crack startled even him, and the broken half rolled off the desk, clattering against the marble floor. Ethan froze, shame crawling hot under his skin. He hated himself in those moments, the way his hands shook, the way the letters mocked him. He hated how predictable it was, how the failure always came no matter how hard he tried. From behind him came a sound, soft, steady, the rhythm of cloth against wood. He turned his head and saw her. Marissa, the new maid. She had entered so quietly he hadn't noticed. She stood near a tall bookshelf, dusting the rows of leather-bound volumes no one ever touched. The afternoon sun caught the edge of her scarf, the dark curls tucked beneath it, the patient movement of her hands. Her presence wasn't like the Tutors, those storm clouds that always blew in with briefcases and sharp eyes. She wasn't judging him, wasn't sighing in pity, she was just there. Ethan's first instinct was to pull the workbook close, to hide the torn page, but it was too late. She had seen the snapped pencil, the crumpled papers on the floor. His heart pounded. He braced for what always came next, a lecture, a reminder of how much money had been wasted on him, how ungrateful he was for failing. But Marissa didn't scold. She didn't even stop dusting. Her voice came gently, a low warmth in a room that had only ever known cold words. "You grip that pencil like it's a sword," she said softly. "No wonder the paper's fighting back." Ethan blinked. The words caught him off guard, tumbling through his thoughts like stones in a river. He stared at her, confusion shadowing his face. Adults didn't say things like that. Adults told him he wasn't trying hard enough. Adults told him he was lazy, spoiled, broken. But this sounded almost like understanding. He frowned, uncertain. "I'm not fighting it," he muttered, his voice low. "It's just stupid." Marissa turned, her eyes meeting his. They weren't sharp or pitying, they were steady. She walked over to the desk, knelt down, and picked up the fallen paper. Her hand smoothed its creases, careful as though the paper mattered, as though he mattered. She laid it back on the desk without a word, then stepped back to her cloth, returning to her work as though nothing unusual had been said. For a long moment, Ethan stared at her back, his mouth slightly open. He didn't understand what had just happened, why her words lingered in the air heavier than scolding ever had. He felt unsettled, curious. Later that night, he lay in bed under the heavy weight of the covers, the room around him dark except for the faint glow of a lamp in the hall. He pulled the failed workbook close to his chest. The page still carried the torn scar of his fous. Allure. But it wasn't the red marks he heard in his mind anymore. It was her voice, quiet but sure. "You grip that pencil like it's a sword. No wonder the paper's fighting back." He whispered it into the darkness, trying the words on his tongue as though they belonged to him. Something inside his chest loosened, not much, but enough to make breathing feel easier. For the first time in months, he drifted into sleep without the heavy certainty of being broken. Downstairs in the kitchen, Clara leaned over to Daniel with a smirk. "She'll be gone by the end of the week. You'll see." Daniel chuckled. "Mark my words, the boy'll chew her up just like the rest." But in the shadows of the vast house, Ethan's whisper hung stubborn in the air. The chandeliers glittered coldly above him in his dreams, but the memory of a maid's gentle smile softened their edges, and though no one could see it yet, something had shifted. In the quiet, a battle the boy thought he was losing had begun to change. The Harrington mansion at night was too quiet. The chandeliers no longer blazed like fire, but even dimmed. Their crystals glittered faintly against the dark, casting cold fragments of light across polished marble floors. In the silence, every sound carried weight: the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, the occasional rustle of servants finishing their duties, the distant hum of the city beyond the gates. Upstairs, Ethan lay on his bed, the workbook still open beside him. His small hands rested on the torn page, fingertips brushing the rough edge where he had erased until the paper gave way. His eyes burned from staring too long, but he couldn't let go of the sentence he'd whispered earlier. No wonder the paper's fighting back. The words repeated in his head like a secret, looping softly, stubbornly. He held on to them the way a drowning boy might cling to driftwood. They were different from anything else he had ever been told. For the first time, the problem didn't feel like him. It felt like something he could face, something outside himself that could be reasoned with. But downstairs, in the warm glow of the staff kitchen, the mood was far less gentle. Clara leaned in close to Chef Daniel, her voice a sharp whisper meant to carry just enough for others to hear. "She thinks she's clever, that maid. Did you see the way she hovered over the boy today, picking up his papers like she's a tutor?" Daniel smirked, kneading dough with heavy hands. "They've flown in specialists from Paris, New York, London, experts who charge more for an hour than she makes in a month. None of them fixed him. And now some maid thinks she'll succeed? Give her a week. She'll be gone before the ink dries on her contract." Their laughter was muffled, but it traveled. In this house, gossip was as constant as the hum of the espresso machine. A young footman snorted into his cup. Ruth, the quietest of the maids, didn't laugh at all. She simply polished a spoon until her reflection blurred, her silence saying more than words. Upstairs, Ethan shifted under his blanket, turning onto his side. The voices below had faded, but he didn't need to hear them to know what they said. He had lived with it for years, the whispers, the pity, the certainty that he was beyond saving. Still, Marissa's words pushed back like a stubborn flame refusing to be snuffed out. He pressed the workbook closer to his chest and whispered into the dark, "Maybe it's not me. Maybe it's just the paper." His voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and fragile hope. For the first time, his whisper wasn't only about being broken, it was about possibility. Marissa, meanwhile, stood alone in the dim hallway outside the staff quarters, her scarf loosened, her hands resting against the strap of her worn handbag. She closed her eyes, hearing echoes of her mother's voice from long ago. "Baby, the letters don't hate you. They just look different to you. We'll figure them out together." The memory tugged at her heart. She remembered nights sitting on a cracked kitchen chair, her mother guiding her finger through the air, tracing letters until they finally began to make sense. Those words had saved her once, and now as she looked up the grand staircase that led to Ethan's room, she wondered if perhaps she was meant to pass them on. In the silence, the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Clara's warnings, Daniel's mockery, even Mr. Harrington's scorn, all of it lingered in the air, heavy as stone. But somewhere above, a boy had fallen asleep, with a torn page on his chest and a whispered thought in his heart that did not taste like defeat. And in that stillness, though no one knew it yet, the foundation of the Harrington mansion had shifted. The staff believed Marissa would fail, the father believed his son was hopeless, but Ethan had carried one simple sentence into his dreams, and that tiny ember of hope was enough to start a fire. Morning would come, and with it, more battles. But tonight, under chandeliers that glittered without warmth, the first crack in the mansion's cold silence had formed, and that crack belonged to a maid no one expected to last. The morning light spilled into the Harrington study like liquid gold, but even the sunlight felt heavy in that room, weighed down by the smell of old ink and failure. The massive desk stood cluttered with papers, most of them scarred with red marks. Ethan sat there again, shoulders hunched, his blonde hair shadowing his eyes as he pressed his pencil into the page with desperate force. His small hand trembled, his lips moving silently, but the letters mocked him once more, twisting and dancing into nonsense. The eraser scraped across the paper like sandpaper until the page thinned to near transparency. Then came the familiar wave, frustration rising hot in his chest, shame wrapping around him like a shroud. His father's voice echoed in his mind, cold and final. Worthless. Maybe it's time to send you away. The thought of boarding school pressed against him like exile, to vanish, to disappear from a life where he had already been invisible. He slammed the workbook shut, his fists trembling. Easy. The voice was gentle, steady, so soft it almost blended with the ticking of the clock. Ethan's head jerked up. There she was, Marissa, standing in the doorway with a cloth in her hand, her other hand resting lightly on the frame as though she had asked the house permission to enter. "You're gripping that pencil like it's a sword again," she said, the corners of her mouth curving into a faint smile. "No wonder the paper's fighting back." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm not fighting," he muttered. "It's just stupid. I can't do it." Marissa stepped closer, her movements careful, as though she were approaching a skittish animal. Her eyes flicked to his hand, where the pencil had carved a faint groove into his skin. "Maybe not stupid," she said softly. "Maybe tired. Maybe trying too hard." The words settled over him like a blanket, not sharp, not dismissive, just steady. Ethan frowned, thrown off balance by kindness. He had no idea what to do with it. Marissa moved quietly to the desk, opening a drawer. She found a rubber band and looped it around the pencil to widen its grip. Then she tore a clean index card in half and slid one piece under the line he was supposed to read, blocking the noisy sea of words above and below. "Sometimes a page is too loud," she murmured. "We quiet it down." Ethan eyed the card with suspicion. "That's cheating." "No," Marissa replied, her tone calm. "See, it's listening." She tapped a slow rhythm on the desk with her fingertip. 4 beats in, 6 beats out. "Close your eyes for a second. Just listen." He hesitated, then obeyed. Her voice broke the sentence into syllables, small stepping stones laid carefully across a rushing river. Her tone was soft, almost like a lullaby. When he opened his eyes, the index card sat beneath the first 2 words. "Try those," she said. His lips shaped the syllables. They wobbled, stumbled, but didn't collapse. He stopped before the third, cheeks burning, certain she would call it failure. 2 words, Marissa said, her smile steady. "That's a start. 2 today, 3 tomorrow." For a moment, silence filled the room, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was soft. Ethan stared at the card, then at her. Something flickered in his chest, small, fragile, but alive. He whispered, almost afraid to believe it. 2 words. Marissa nodded once, satisfied. Slow, small, steady. That's how we win. In the hallway, footsteps clicked, the sharp rhythm of heels on marble. Miss Keene, Mr. Harrington's assistant, appeared in the doorway with her tablet held like a shield. Her gaze swept over Marissa, the card, the boy. A polite smile stretched across her face, one that carried no warmth at all. "The study is not on the cleaning schedule before 11, she said crisply. Then to Ethan, "Your father wants your signature on the withdrawal form for Arcadia Academy. He'll handle the rest." The word withdrawal fell into the room like a hammer. Ethan's chest tightened. His fingers clutched the index card. Miss Keene's heels clicked away, and a heavier tread followed soon after. Mr. Harrington entered, his presence filling the room like thunderclouds. His shadow fell across the desk before he spoke. "We're finished pretending," he said, voice flat. "Arcadia accepts midterm entries. Forms will be finalized by Friday." His cufflinks caught the light, small suns that only shone for him. His gaze flicked over Marissa, dismissive, as though she were a piece of furniture. "Carry on," he said, and walked out. Ethan's knuckles went white. For a long moment, the study held its breath. Marissa kept her eyes on the desk, her voice calm as ever. Open your hand. Slowly, Ethan obeyed. The pencil had left a shallow mark across his skin. Marissa touched the index card, her voice low, steady, almost like a promise. Words don't hate you, Ethan. They just need more time to introduce themselves. The boy's throat tightened. His chest ached, but for the first time the words didn't feel like enemies. They felt like something he might someday understand. And in that fragile moment, while the chandeliers glittered their cold brilliance above, a boy who had only known shame whispered 2 words without falling apart. And it was not nothing. The next afternoon, the Harrington mansion lay quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down like a weight. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, throwing pale stripes across the polished floors. Ethan sat at the study desk, the same desk that had felt like a battlefield for years. His workbook lay open, the index card Marissa had given him resting neatly on top. He wasn't scribbling this time, not yet. He was waiting. Marissa entered with her usual calm steps, a tray in one hand to keep up appearances. But tucked beneath her arm, hidden carefully, was something unexpected, a worn cardboard box. She set the tray down on a side table, placed the box on the floor, and pulled out a stick of white chalk. Its edge was dulled from years in storage, the cardboard frayed. Ethan blinked at it in surprise. "What's that?" he asked, suspicion tugging at his voice. Marissa smiled faintly. "Chalk. Found it in the basement closet. Thought we'd give it a try." Ethan frowned. "That's for kids." "Exactly," she said softly. She dragged a portable board, dusty and forgotten, into the roads. And stood it against the wall. The chalk squeaked as she drew a big letter across its black surface. The sound was sharp, but the shape was undeniable. Bold, simple, clean. "Letters like to be big first," Marissa explained, stepping aside so he could see. "Easier to see their bones before they shrink down on a page." Ethan stared at the letter. It looked harmless, almost friendly, larger than the tiny versions that danced on his workbook. "Now trace it," Marissa said. "Not with a pencil, with your finger, in the air." He hesitated, cheeks warming. "That's stupid." She didn't push. She simply lifted her own finger and traced the letter in the air, her movement slow, steady, graceful. "Like this. Try." Ethan shifted in his chair, then, almost against his own will, lifted his hand. His finger cut through the air, shaky at first, but the stroke mirrored hers. "Good," Marissa said, her voice warm. "Again." The second time, his line was steadier. The third time, something flickered in his chest, a tiny glow of pride he tried to smother, but couldn't. Marissa turned back to the board, writing another letter, then another. She spoke them aloud slowly, her voice soft as a lullaby. "Say it with me." Ethan whispered the sounds, awkward but determined. He stumbled, his voice cracking, but he didn't stop. For the first time in years, he was saying letters without dread choking him. When a whole word formed in his mouth, his eyes widened. I did it," he whispered, almost afraid to believe it. Marissa clapped softly, grinning. "See? They don't hate you. You just needed them to slow down long enough to be heard." From the doorway, Clara lingered with a tray meant for Mr. Harrington. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of the chalkboard, the maid standing like a teacher, the boy tracing letters in the air. She retreated quickly, her face tight, carrying gossip in her chest, like contraband. In the kitchen, Clara's voice was sharp. "She's in there with chalk, like it's a schoolyard." Daniel barked a laugh, pounding dough with his fists. A maid with sidewalk chalk against dyslexia? The boy's doomed. She'll be fired before Friday. But Ruth, polishing silver quietly, finally spoke. "Or maybe," she said softly, "the boy just needs someone who understands." Back in the study, Ethan traced the letters again, his lips moving, his finger cutting through the air. The sound of chalk scraping against the board filled the silence, but it wasn't cruel this time. It was steady, hopeful. Marissa stepped back, her hands folded, watching him with a quiet pride she didn't voice. Ethan's smile was small, almost fragile, but real, sunlight breaking through a storm cloud. For the first time, the study didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a classroom. And for the first time, Ethan Harrington believed maybe, just maybe, he wasn't broken at all. The mansion always seemed colder in the evenings, as though the chandeliers themselves conspired with the marble floors to strip the warmth out of the air. Ethan sat at the study desk, the chalkboard propped against the wall, a faint dust of white powder settling across his sleeves. He had been tracing letters in the air with his finger, whispering syllables under his breath, and for once the weight of failure wasn't crushing him. Marissa stood nearby, not overbearing, not pressing, just there. Her presence felt like a lighthouse on a foggy shore, steady, distant enough to let him steer on his own, close enough to remind him he wasn't alone. The index card lay on the desk, the rubber-banded pencil resting beside it. These weren't tricks, not really. They were lifelines. "Try it again," she said gently, pointing to a short line in his workbook. He leaned forward, lips moving carefully. The words wobbled but held. He reached the end of the line, his chest swelling as if he had run a mile. A grin almost broke across his face, but before it could, the sound came. Footsteps. Heavy, certain, deliberate. Ethan froze. His stomach knotted instantly. He knew that sound, the rhythm of shoes that had marched through boardrooms and crushed men twice his size. Mr. Harrington. The boy's eyes darted to Marissa, panic flashing across his face. He whispered, quick and desperate, "If he sees—" The door swung open. Mr. Harrington filled the doorway like a shadow stretching across the room. His suit was as sharp as always, his cufflinks catching the chandelier's glow. His gaze swept over the scene in an instant. His son hunched over a workbook, the chalkboard scrawled with letters, and the black maid standing at his side like some misplaced tutor. Ethan's breath caught. His heart hammered so loudly he thought the whole house must hear it. The silence between them stretched, unbearable. Harrington's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. The room seemed to shrink under his presence. Then, in a voice small but steady, Ethan said something no one expected. She helps me." The words cracked the air like glass shattering. Ethan's lips trembled after speaking them, but he didn't take them back. His chest rose and fell, the confession hanging between father and maid like a fragile bridge. Mr. Harrington's eyes flicked to Marissa, cold and assessing. He looked at her as if she were out of place, a servant who had stepped into a role she had no right to touch. For a heartbeat, Ethan was sure his father would explode, fire her on the spot, maybe worse. He braced for it, every muscle in his body tightening. But instead, Harrington's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He moved forward, reached into his jacket, and placed a sheet of paper on the desk. A test. Fresh from his briefcase. He didn't say a word about the maid, didn't acknowledge her at all. He set the paper down in front of Ethan, tapped it once with his finger, then turned and walked out. The door closed with a muted thud. Ethan stared at the paper, his hands trembling. For once, he wasn't terrified of it. He looked up at Marissa, his voice shaking but alive. "He didn't stop us," he whispered. Marissa kept her eyes calm, her voice even, though her heart still pounded. "Then let's show him what you can do." And for the first time in his life, Ethan leaned into a test not with fear, but with determination. Downstairs, the staff whispered like restless birds. Clara's voice was sharp with certainty. "He caught her. She'll be gone by tomorrow." But Ruth, polishing silver, shook her head with a rare smile tugging at her lips. "No," she said softly. "The boy said she helps him, and that changes everything." The Harrington mansion began to breathe differently in the days that followed. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, like the shift of air before a storm. But if one paid attention, if one lingered in the long corridors or listened at the edges of the grand study, there was something new threading its way through the silence. Ethan was changing. Every afternoon, the boy who once hid from books now arrived at the study desk before Marissa even stepped into the room. His pencils were sharpened, his workbook opened, the index card placed neatly on the first page. He no longer slouched as though waiting for failure to crush him. Instead, his back straightened, his chin tilted just slightly higher. His eyes, still nervous, still fragile, held a flicker of something unfamiliar. Readiness. Marissa noticed it, though she never said it aloud. She carried her tray or her dusting cloth as always, moving about the room with the quiet grace of someone who knew invisibility was often safer. Yet every so often, when Ethan sounded out a line correctly, she would allow her eyes to meet his. Not with celebration, too much pressure would break him, but with a nod. Small, steady, enough to say, "I see you." Ethan lived for those nods. The staff, of course, had noticed too. Clara whispered to Daniel in the kitchen, her tone sharp with suspicion. "He's waiting for her like she's a tutor. It won't last." Daniel scoffed, slamming a pot onto the stove. "The boss won't stand for it. The boy's improvement doesn't matter. Rules are rules. She's overstepping." But Ruth, quiet Ruth, leaned forward with her silver still in hand. "He smiles now," she said simply. "I saw it. When's the last time any of you saw him smile?" They had no answer. Upstairs, Ethan traced letters not with panic, but with patience. The index card was his shield, Marissa's rhythm, his anchor. He no longer tore pages in half. He no longer shoved his workbook under his mattress. He made mistakes, yes, plenty, but they no longer carried the same weight. Each stumble became another step, each slip another chance. And then one afternoon, something extraordinary happened. He finished a line, a full sentence, read aloud, his voice trembling but clear. When he looked up, Marissa's smile was waiting, warm, unshaken. "You see?" she said softly. "The words don't hate you. They just needed you to give them time." Ethan's throat tightened, but this time it wasn't with shame. It was something else, something almost like pride. He whispered the sentence again under his breath, just to feel it stay whole in his mouth. That night he did not hide the paper. Instead he carried it to the kitchen, heart pounding, and pinned it with a magnet to the refrigerator. The staff stopped in their tracks, staring at the messy handwriting, the uneven lines. It wasn't perfect, but there it was, on display. "For once," Ruth murmured, "he's not hiding." The mansion itself seemed to shift after that. Where once the halls echoed only with Mr. Harrington's footsteps and clipped orders, there was now the occasional sound of laughter. Quiet, hesitant, but real. Ethan laughed at his own mistakes. Sometimes he laughed when Marissa hummed off key as she dusted. Even the chandeliers seemed warmer, their light softer, less cruel. But hanging over all of it was a shadow, Arcadia, the boarding school. The withdrawal forms were still on Mr. Harrington's desk, signed and ready. Miss Keene reminded Ethan twice a day about appointments and codes of conduct. The exile loomed. Ethan knew it. Marissa knew it. Neither spoke of it. Instead, she left him with 3 words on a sticky note, pressed carefully to the top of his workbook. Slow, small, steady. And as the days slipped toward the looming exam, those words became his mantra. He whispered them under his breath in the hall, in the kitchen, in the dark of his room at night. The boy who once whispered, "Maybe I really am broken," now whispered something else entirely. Slow, small, steady. The mansion's silence was no longer the silence of shame. It was the silence of waiting, holding its breath, as if it, too, knew something was about to change. The morning of the exam arrived without warning, quiet and heavy as snow. No tutors bustled through the doors with expensive briefcases. No secretaries rushed in carrying study packets and reminders. For the first time, the Grand Harrington mansion prepared for a test not with chaos, but with silence. Ethan woke earlier than usual. His uniform shirt was buttoned crookedly, his hair combed by his own uncertain hands, but he looked at himself in the mirror longer than he ever had before. There was nervous energy in his eyes, yes, but also something else, something fragile, but alive. Pride. He whispered the words that had carried him through the past weeks. Slow, small, steady. Downstairs, the staff gathered as though it were a holiday. Clara leaned close to Daniel, her voice sharp as a knife. "Today's the day. He'll crumble. The boss will send her packing when it's done." Daniel smirked, wiping flour from his hands. "Poor kid doesn't stand a chance." But Ruth, polishing silver at the counter, only smiled faintly. "Maybe today's the day he proves you wrong." The house waited, the air charged like the pause before thunder. In the study, the exam paper sat on the desk, the ink on its cover sheet crisp, the lamplight glaring across its surface. Ethan stood in the doorway, workbook clutched against his ribs. His chest rose and fell quickly, his breath catching as he stared at the page waiting to swallow him. For years, these sheets of paper had been his executioners. He had learned to fear the scratch of a pencil more than raised voices. And then he saw her. Marissa stood near the window, cloth in her hand, pretending to dust the sill. She didn't hover, didn't push. She just looked at him with that same calm presence, the quiet steadiness that had become his anchor. When their eyes met, she gave the smallest nod, the same nod she had learned from her mother long ago. "You can do this." Ethan stepped inside, his shoes whispering against the carpet. He sat down at the desk, smoothing the paper with both hands. The pencil lay before him, the rubber band still wrapped around it, widening its grip. He lifted it carefully, his hands trembled but less than before. "Remember," Marissa's voice came, barely audible. Slow, small, steady. He nodded. Then, for the first time in his life, Ethan leaned into an exam, not as an enemy, but as a conversation. The letters did not mock him this time. The index card slid down, shielding the noisy lines above and below, quieting the chaos. He read the first line silently, his lips shaping the words. His heart pounded, but his hands did not shake. Minutes passed, then an hour. The only sound was the scratch of graphite, the rhythm of his breathing, and the occasional shift of Marissa's cloth across the window frame. At one point, he stumbled, letters slipping, the panic rising, his throat closed. His chest tightened, but then he felt it again, the soft nod from across the room. Slow, small, steady. He pressed his pencil down, his breaths aligning with the rhythm she had taught him. The panic ebbed. The letters held. By the time he reached the end of the paper, his shoulders were no longer curled inward. He straightened. He set the pencil down with care, not defeat. His breath shook as he stood, but there was no shame in it this time. Only release. He held the exam in both hands, the pages trembling, and walked toward the long corridor that led to his father's office. Every step felt like the house itself was holding its breath. The chandeliers glittered above him, colder than ever, but they did not own him anymore. Marissa remained by the window, her cloth stilled in her hand. She didn't follow. She didn't need to. He looked back once before the door closed behind him, and she gave him that same nod. The boy who had once whispered, "Maybe I'm broken," now carried his paper forward, not knowing if it would be his undoing or his victory, but for the first time in his life, he walked with his shoulders held just a little higher, and the entire mansion waited in silence, listening for what would come next. The office smelled of leather and ink, the air heavy with the weight of contracts stacked in neat piles across the vast mahogany desk. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below, its skyline glimmering in the late morning sun. But inside, the light felt muted, as if swallowed by the sheer force of Mr. Harrington's presence. Ethan stood in the doorway, the exam clutched in his hands. His heart pounded so hard it seemed to echo in his ears. He swallowed, stepped forward, and placed the paper carefully on the desk before his father. Mr. Harrington didn't look up at first. His pen scratched across another contract, his signet ring tapping impatiently against the wood. Only after a pause did he set the pen aside and lift the exam, his brow furrowed, already preparing for disappointment. He scanned the first line, his eyes narrowed. His gaze darted lower, moving quickly now down the page, then to the second. His hands stilled, the paper trembled just slightly between his fingers. Ethan stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. He expected the familiar sigh, the scorn, the inevitable word, worthless. He braced himself for the cold blade of criticism. But none came. The silence stretched, thicker than shouting. Mr. Harrington's jaw worked, but no words left his mouth. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his eyes flicking over answers, his brow tightening, loosening, tightening again. Then he saw it. At the top corner, written in bold, undeniable ink, A. The billionaire's lips parted, but nothing emerged. His hand tightened on the page as though it might vanish if he let go. For years, every sheet of paper his son touched had been marked in red, failure, after failure, after failure. Now here it was, not a pity grade, not a manipulated mark, but an A. Clean, whole, real. Ethan's chest ached. His voice cracked, but he forced the words out anyway. I did it. The boy's whisper filled the office louder than thunder. Mr. Harrington finally lifted his gaze, staring at his son with an expression Ethan had never seen before, something raw, unsettled, almost human. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. How? Ethan's lips trembled. His eyes flicked toward the door, to the shadow just beyond it. Marissa stood there, her cloth still in her hand, head slightly bowed, as though she were invisible. But invisibility couldn't contain the truth anymore. Mr. Harrington followed his son's gaze. For the first time he really saw her, not as furniture, not as a servant, but as the person who had done what his fortune never could. Her. The word hung unspoken, but it thundered in his chest. Ethan's throat tightened, but he said it anyway. She helps me. The billionaire's jaw clenched. He set the exam down carefully, almost reverently, as if it were fragile glass. His silence now was not dismissal, it was reckoning. Outside the office, the staff lingered in the corridor, straining to hear. Clara's voice was sharp with certainty. He'll crush her. She's finished. But Ruth smiled faintly, polishing her spoon until her reflection gleamed. No, she whispered. Something's different. Inside, Mr. Harrington leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. He stared at the paper, the bold A staring back at him, shaking the empire of pride he had built around himself. For the first time in years, his son had not brought him shame. He had brought him silence, the kind of silence that rewrites everything. And in that silence, the unthinkable had already begun. The corridors of the Harrington mansion buzzed that evening, though no one raised their voice above a whisper. Word had already spread. The boy had walked into Mr. Harrington's office with a test, and when he walked out, he wasn't crying. That alone was enough to send the staff into hushed speculation. Clara was sharpest, her yes, glittering with certainty as she folded linen napkins in the pantry. Mark my words, she's finished. The boss doesn't like lines crossed. A maid acting like a tutor, he'll have her out by morning. Daniel grunted in agreement, kneading dough with forceful hands. Doesn't matter if the boy got an A, Harrington will see it as disrespect. She overstepped. But Ruth only smiled quietly, polishing silver until her reflection stared back. The boy said she helps him, she murmured, and that changes everything. Upstairs, Marissa walked the long corridor toward the office, her steps steady though her heart pounded against her ribs. Miss Keene had delivered the summons with her usual clipped tone. Mr. Harrington would like a word, alone. The emphasis on that last word had carried warning, as though this was less an invitation than an execution. When Marissa entered, the office was dim, the evening light casting long shadows across the city skyline. Mr. Harrington sat behind his desk, the exam paper in front of him, its bold A illuminated under the lamplight. He didn't look up immediately. He simply tapped his signet ring against the desk, each click echoing like a judge's gavel. You, he said at last, his voice low, controlled, steel-wrapped in velvet. You taught him. Marissa stood straight, her hands folded in front of her apron. She did not flinch. I helped him see the words differently, she replied quietly. He was never broken. For a long moment, silence reigned. Harrington's eyes narrowed, studying her like an equation he could not solve. He had bought the finest tutors, flown in specialists from around the world, invested fortunes in every solution money could buy, All had failed, yet here stood a woman in scuffed shoes and a faded scarf, claiming no magic but patience, and she had succeeded. "Do you know," Harrington said finally, his tone carrying a dangerous calm, "how many experts I've paid to fix him, how many doors I've opened, and none of them managed what you have." Marissa's voice stayed steady. "Sometimes it isn't about fixing. Sometimes it's about listening." The billionaire leaned back in his leather chair, his gaze sharp, unsettled. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls themselves were waiting. Then slowly, he set the exam down and laced his fingers together. "You saved him," he admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth but true all the same. "So tell me, what do you want? A raise? A promotion?" Marissa's throat tightened, but she shook her head. "I want nothing for myself, sir, only for the boy to know he's not alone." Her answer disarmed him. Harrington stared at her as though she were something foreign, something he could not measure with contracts and currency. For the first time, respect flickered behind his eyes. Not warm, not gentle, but undeniable. "From now on," he said finally, his voice clipped, decisive, "you are not just a maid. You will be his tutor, officially." Down in the kitchen, gossip crackled like fire. Clara's eyes widened when the news reached them. "Tutor? The maid?" she whispered, as though the words themselves were forbidden. Daniel dropped his spoon, jaw slack. "Impossible." But Ruth's smile bloomed fully now, her voice soft but sure. "Not impossible. Justice." In the hall outside the office, Ethan waited, his hands clench, Ed nervously. When Marissa emerged, her scarf slipping slightly from her hair, he rushed to her. His face glowed, brighter than the chandeliers above. "I did it," he whispered, as though afraid the moment might vanish if spoken too loudly. Marissa knelt, her eyes level with his, her voice warm enough to steady the earth itself. "No, Ethan, you did it." And for the first time, the boy believed her. The Harrington mansion did not change overnight, but the change was unmistakable all the same. Where silence had once ruled, laughter now flickered in and out of the halls like sunlight slipping through heavy curtains. The chandeliers glittered as always, but their cold brilliance seemed warmer, softened by the sound of a boy's voice reading aloud from his workbook in the evenings. Ethan had begun to flourish. He no longer slouched at the study desk as though bracing for failure to strike. Instead, he leaned forward with focus, his pencil moving with care. His letters, though not perfect, were steadier, his words no longer collapsing under panic. When he stumbled, he no longer shoved the paper away in shame. He tried again, and each time Marissa was there, sometimes humming, sometimes offering a nod, sometimes reminding him gently, slow, small, steady. The staff noticed the difference. Ruth beamed openly whenever she passed the boy in the hall. Even Clara, once sharp and skeptical, found herself nodding respectfully when Marissa entered a room. And Daniel, too proud to admit defeat, no longer scoffed when the boy's name was mentioned. The whispers of doubt had been replaced with something rarer in that household: admiration. At school, Ethan's teachers marveled at the shift. His handwriting, once nearly illegible, had grown steadier. He read aloud in class with a voice still shaky but determined. The boy who once shrank in his seat now raised his hand, tentatively at Fee. Asked then with growing confidence, "Is this the same child?" they wondered. But the truest transformation was not in his grades, nor in the staff's softened glances. It was in Ethan himself. At night, he no longer whispered, "Maybe I'm broken." Instead, as he pulled the blanket up to his chin, he whispered something new, "Maybe I can." Mr. Harrington noticed too. Though he never said the words aloud, he lingered more often in the doorways of the study, watching his son sound out sentences, his face lit with quiet determination. Once, when Ethan stumbled over a word and started to flinch, Harrington saw Marissa touch the edge of the desk, grounding him with her calm. Ethan steadied himself and tried again. Harrington turned away before they could see the faintest shadow of a smile touch his lips. One evening, after a long day of meetings and contracts, Harrington sat in his office alone. Papers lay spread before him, but his eyes kept straying to the framed photographs on the wall. Images of towers he had built, deals he had struck. All symbols of an empire founded on pride, precision, control. But now, sitting quietly on his desk, was something that unsettled him far more than any contract ever had. Ethan's exam. The bold A stared back at him. Slowly, Harrington reached for a frame, one usually reserved for awards and certificates, and placed the paper inside. He hung it on the wall behind his desk, above the shelves lined with deals worth millions. When the light from the chandelier struck the glass, the letter gleamed. It was not wealth, it was not empire, but it was proof. Proof that his son was not worthless, not broken, not lost. Proof that someone had seen him when no one else had. The next morning, Ethan entered the office, his eyes catching on the wall. His breath caught in his throat. His father had framed it. The paper that once would have been tossed aside, dismissed, forgotten, was now displayed with honor. Ethan turned to his father, uncertain if he should speak, but Mr. Harrington only said, his voice rough, "You earned it." Later, Marissa found Ethan in the study, his eyes brighter than she had ever seen them. He held the sticky note she had once given him, its edges worn from being carried too many times, slow, small, steady. He looked up at her, his voice soft but sure. It worked. Marissa smiled, her throat tight with pride she would never boast about. It always does. That night, as the chandeliers glittered above, the mansion did not echo with shame or silence. Instead, it glowed with the sound of a boy's voice, reading aloud steadily, carefully, as though every word was a victory. And in that house built on billions, the greatest treasure was not money or power or pride. It was patience. It was presence. It was the miracle carried quietly by a woman no one had noticed, until she changed everything. Because sometimes the greatest justice is not in conquering the world, but in helping someone find their voice inside it.